We're going to start section 7.6 today, which is inverse trig functions. We've got to be careful here. You worked with them in geometry. You probably forget, but they're a little more critical once we get into this part of the trig course. So for just a quick review, these three functions are asking you to evaluate the cosine, sine, or tangent of a specific angle in degrees. And to do this, you'd first make sure your calculator's in the degree setting, and then you just type in cosine 35 like I'd showed you, hit enter. You do that for the other three values. And in this case, I'm asking you to round to the hundredths place. And these are the values that you're going to get in return. So just to kind of highlight what you're actually doing. When we're actually working with a trig function here, you're evaluating the trig function for the angle measure, and the return value, the output, is a ratio that you can kind of associate with the, for cosine would be the adjacent divided by the hypotenuse. And it gets messy. So your calculator spits out this long decimal value, and we usually round it here. We're going to reverse this process. Let me get into the next slide here and talk about the inverse trig functions. The inverse trig functions are similar to the way you think about like an x squared versus a square root. A square root is the inverse function of an x squared, and vice versa. The x squared is an inverse function of the square root. So in this case, the inverse cosine function is it's the inverse function of the cosine function. So in this particular case, what we can do is we can identify the angle measure if we have the ratio, and we use the inverse cosine function. So this is cosine to the negative first. It's red inverse cosine. And what you have to understand is the input for this is the ratio that the typical cosine function spits out. And the output of this function is the angle measure. And you just need to make sure you're in the correct setting. So in this case, we're dealing with degrees. So you want to make sure your calculator's in degrees, and then you want to go to where you find the trig buttons on your calculator, sine, cosine, and tangent. Usually the inverse sine, inverse cosine, inverse tangent keys are right in the same menu, or in some calculators you have to use the second or shift key to access them. But we're going to use these functions, and we use these functions when we want to find the angle measure, and we have the ratio here. So inverse cosine of 0.82 is going to return 35 degrees. Inverse sine of negative 0.12 returns negative 7 degrees, and inverse tangent of 5.14 returns 79 degrees. You want to try this right now on your own calculator to verify that you can do it correctly. We will be using these often as we move forward, and this is a really good time to just pause and check that you can do that. And again, just as a reminder, when we're working with these functions, the input is not the angle measure anymore. The input is the ratio, the output is the angle measure. We will also do this with radians. So find the angle to the nearest hundredth of a radian. Same trig ratio, 0.82. We're still going to work with the cosine relationship, but because we're looking for the angle measure, we need to use the inverse cosine, and we have to take the inverse cosine of the trig ratio, 0.82, and in return, we're going to get radian measures here. So inverse cosine of 0.82 is going to return 0.61 radians. Remember, these are angles. Inverse sine of negative 0.12 is going to return negative 0.12 radians, and inverse tangent of 5.14 is going to return 1.38 radians. Okay, and again, this would be a good time to pause. Make sure you can do this on your calculator accurately in radians, know how to shift or change your mode from degrees to radians here. I'm just going to walk you through one of the calculations. So I'm using the Desmos scientific calculator. On the main screen, I can see the sine, cosine, and tangent functions. However, I don't want to use those. We're going to work on part A for the degrees and radians that we just went through. So what I need to do is first make sure I understand, am I working in degrees or radians? So right now I'm in degrees. If I wanted to go to radians, I'd hit over. So I'm going to go back to degrees. And if I want to use the inverse functions, I have to select the function tab and work with these three functions right here. So the inverse cosine of 0.82 is going to return 34.915 and so on degrees. And if I wanted to do this in radians, I can simply just change my setting. Some of your calculators will require you to re-enter these values, but the inverse cosine of 0.82, remember this is a ratio, is going to return 0.6093 and so on radian measurements there. When we're working with inverse trig functions, what you have to understand is there's always only going to be one angle measure that's given in return, and that has to do with how the inverse trig functions are defined. What is the domain of their inverse trig function? So if you remember when we were working with certain trig functions and identifying angle measures, we had to identify all possible angle measures in degrees or radians. A similar example would be right here, where we ended up with pi over 2 plus 2 pi n. And that's because, you know, they're circular functions, so we can continue to rotate around that circle infinitely many times and end up at the same location on the circle. Inverse trig functions have to take that into account. And when we work with a function, we always want one output for each input. And so we have to modify the domain of the inverse function. So we'll talk about that in a second, but we're not going to have an infinite set of angle measures that the inverse trig functions spit out. So that's the first thing we need to address. Another thing I want to point out is this inverse cosine of x notation here. You have to understand that this is not the same as the secant of x. If you remember, secant of x that we learned last week is the secant of x is defined as 1 over cosine of x. This function right here is not saying that at all. This -1 is notation that we use in mathematics for the inverse of a function. If you go back to algebra 2, you remember we use that inverse notation, f to the -1st of x, when we were dealing with inverse functions. That's what this that's what this notation means. Over here, secant of x is the reciprocal function for cosine. So when we say secant of x, we can also identify it as 1 divided by x. So we have to clarify that this is not a true statement. Inverse functions undo or reverse the standard function. So cosine to the -1st, we enter a fraction, which is a trig ratio similar to adjacent over hypotenuse, into the inverse function, and it spits out a return as an angle measure. Okay. Also, things to keep in mind. We also worked on the reciprocal keys on our calculator. So x to the -1st key, or 1 over x key. Some of you have one, some of you have the other, but usually you don't have both. It's a little bit easier here to see that this is the reciprocal key. However, it's easy to get confused with this one. So x to the -1st is a reciprocal function on your calculator. And if I wanted to compare, the secant of an angle and the cosine of an angle, those are reciprocal functions, and that's when we introduce this key. Keep in mind that x to the -1st is not an inverse function for anything. It's a reciprocal, so we would not use x to the -1st with cosine to the -1st. They're two different functions on your calculator there.